The more I looked at the catechism, I realized this is the Christian worldview in a very simple, plain stated form. There's a beginning, middle, and end. And I think even, our preaching needs to be catechetical. Just always be bringing up the catechism. Try to connect the sermon to catechetical concepts. What does it mean to be a human being? Why might God give us this commandment? How is our God different than other things we worship? The flip in the Christian worldview is that God is the center of everything. He is the main character, and we're supporting actors, and He allows us and invites us to be part of it. That is the opposite of American feel-good consumer religion. There's not a lot of forgiveness in the secular world. I think somebody's called this like secular hell, like you're just canceled, you're done. We as Christians have this beautiful tool of confession and absolution by which we can have a good conscience, and we don't have to live in the past.
All right, and Bennett says we are back. We're back with Dr. John Rasmussen, and we talked last time about apologetics, secularism, MTD. Is that right?
Moralistic therapeutic deism.
Yes.
Easier to say MTD.
MTD.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Kind of dealing with, what's going on with the philosophy within the world. What's the worldview? How are normal people thinking? How does Christianity interact with that? We'll get into that a little bit as well here, maybe with some formal apologetics, but what we kind of want to lean into here on the front end is what you worked with in your doctoral work, which is understanding apologetics, but specifically the way that catechesis works in an apologetic way. Mm-hmm. And you use the Small Catechism. So if you just kind of want to introduce what drew you to this as you kind of leaned into this for your doctorate's degree, and then we'll kind of get into understanding what catechesis is and then how we can maybe improve this within our church.
Yeah, in my first exposure to Lutheranism, I didn't even know there was a catechism.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was a kind of a really well-kept secret. And in fact, I did not learn the catechism until seminary. I had to memorize it in seminary. Mm-hmm. And I came to really love it and really just hold on to the words and, simple lines like, He redeemed me, a lost and condemned person. Fear, love, and trust God above all things, that I may be His own and live under Him in His kingdom. And those things have a way of kind of orienting your daily life, even orienting your desires as a human being. But the more I taught the catechism in the parish setting, I just realized, this isn't being integrated well. It's not sticking. Because a lot of times our young people don't have a framework in which they can understand the catechism because they may not have a Christian worldview developed yet. And the more I looked at the catechism, I realized this is the Christian worldview in a very simple, plain stated form. There's a beginning, middle, and end. If we think of it as a narrative, as we start with the Ten Commandments, we're beginning with creation and how God meets us as God and us as creatures, our duties and responsibilities to our neighbor. And then we move into the question of sin, fall. The law reveals our sin. Then as we come into the creed, we have the whole narrative of how God created, redeemed, and is sanctifying us. And then the life of the Lord's Prayer is really the life of Christian hope in looking forward and knowing what to ask for and what to desire and anticipate. So as I thought about that, and then I compared that with apologetics, I thought, well, okay, Luther's Small Catechism is a worldview. It is a narrative, story form worldview. It answers questions like, who am I? Why am I here? What's my purpose? What's the problem? And what's the solution? Well, if there are other worldviews competing for people's affections and intellect, those are also stories too. Now, so you could take secularism, for example, and say, who am I? Well, I'm just biology, right? I'm just my genes, I'm just matter. What's my purpose? Well, I guess from a biological perspective, it's to pass on genes and survive, right? At a deeper existential level, I don't know why I'm here. I have to create a meaning. outside of myself. Well, I have to find it from culture or society, or I have to create something. What's the problem? Well, there really isn't a problem. I mean, makes me think of a line from a song by the Shins. There's no design, the flaws are fine. It's death, disease, aggression, selfishness. They're all kind of baked into what it means to be a human being in a pretty cold, meaningless universe that has no compassion for our place in it. Well then, okay, that's the problem, but what's the solution? Well, the solution is going to always be human things like progress, advances in medical technology, things like that. Or just human ability to have better politics, better education. Salvation by works, basically, by human works. So I just began to kind of think in that framework, and I realized as we do catechesis, we need to help people understand the different worldviews and be able to deconstruct them or compare them with the Christian worldview. So there's a wonderful quote by Reformed apologist Cornelius Van Til, and he says that that apologetics is the comparison between the Christian philosophy of life and the non-Christian philosophy of life. It's a comparison between the two. And that is what I think we need to be doing in catechesis. We need to be breaking down, this is what secularism teaches, this is what moralistic therapeutic deism, as kind of ambiguous as it is, this is what it teaches. This is the worldview. Is it consistent? Does it make sense? Is it livable? Now let's look at the catechism and see that all these things are consistent and they're livable and they're good.
How does it play out when we use the catechism as a teaching tool, but we perhaps miss that, right? So you mentioned, early on you would teach the catechism and it just didn't seem like it was resonating. So what happens when we just kind of get right to the meat of it, but we don't frame it in a way where the kids understand why this is important and relevant?
Well, I think it can still do good things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's God's word, the Lord's Prayer, for example, or the 10 Commandments. It gets deeply rooted in your heart. I think that's the good thing about memorization. But if you've never been taught that this is actually true and it connects to reality, then you're just going to kind of hold on to it as one other thing.
Mm-hmm.
And probably a pretty boring thing in your week. As like a middle schooler, you've got sports, you've got television, you've got your friends, you've got all kinds of other things, your phone maybe. And then having to sit in a desk and go through confirmation class after a long day of school. No thanks, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll just do the bare minimum to get through it. So yeah, I think, and then, you go to college and you haven't really thought robustly, intellectually about your faith. You haven't been taught why these things are true and why they matter, then it's not too hard for your faith to deconstruct. I remember a quote from Nancy Pearcey. She wrote a book a long time ago, early 2000s, called Total Truth. She's a Presbyterian, but she grew up Lutheran. And she says in the opening of the book that, and she became an atheist in her teen years. I think it was the work of Francis Schaeffer who led her back to faith. The Spirit used that to call her back to faith. But reflecting on her Lutheran upbringing, she said, I had learned creeds, memorized hymns, scripture, and prayers, catechism, but I was never taught to defend the Christian faith or why it was good and true. And I was never taught to critique other worldviews. Thanks be to God, the Spirit, called her back to faith. But in the meantime, I think she had a bout with atheism.
Mm-hmm. So how do you go about doing this, let's say at kind of a confirmation level? So how do you structure the way that you do confirmation? What's your goal? How do you orient the conversations and the teachings? How do you go about doing this?
It's hard to do it in confirmation because middle schoolers they're not as deep conceptual thinkers yet. They're getting there. They're more concrete, and so I think that in class or in seminars that we do, we try to ask those big questions like, what's the purpose of your life? Like, let's talk about that for a minute. What's driving you? Like, why is something right or something wrong? So in your teaching, you want to really get underneath these questions, like help them to see God's laws, not just as God's laws, but God's laws in relationship to being a created human being in his world.
Mm-hmm.
You can only get so far with that. And that's why catechesis has to be this lifelong venture. And this is why it has to come out in your preaching. I think in your preaching, you have to always be kind of like going deeper, like not just telling you this is the commandment, but then saying, why does this make sense? And what's underneath this? And also from the pulpit, critiquing other worldviews, taking them seriously, but critiquing them and showing where they're inconsistent. Kind of like you were talking about previously about where Keller would say, this is a wrong answer and another wrong answer, but here's the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we've done at the college level, we'll have university students who have grown up Lutheran, but maybe they haven't thought a lot about worldview. So they've done catechism, but maybe not worldview. Every year we do a Ask Pastor Anything event. And so we'll get a whole bunch of college kids together, and we use an app called Slido where they can just go in and they can type in their questions. They pop up on a screen. And then I just go through one by one and answer those questions. And in answering those questions, always helping them to kind of see the deeper issues, the deeper questions underneath the question.
Mm-hmm. What kind of questions do they normally ask?
Well, sometimes it can be as simple as like, is my dog going to go to heaven? Stuff like that. But sometimes they'll get deeper into a lot of times suffering and goodness of God questions. Those are typically big. What happens when somebody commits suicide? Is there any hope for them? Or actually one that comes up quite a bit is, how do I resist sin when I keep failing?
Mm-hmm.
Or relationship questions like, how do I know the right person is the right person? How should I pick out a spouse? Is it okay to date a non-Christian? Do you need to share, the same confession of faith? And then I get a lot of denominationally specific questions like, why are we not Roman Catholic? Why, kind of the non-denominational baptism sacrament questions.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole gamut, yeah.
Yeah. Is it worth going through some of those questions just to kind of showcase how, as you answer these, it's not a one-dimensional answer, right? But you're bringing it back into, we have a cohesive system of thought.
Yeah.
So let's remind ourselves what that system of thought is so that we can lean on this to come up with a coherent answer. Do you want to start with the suffering one? How do you kind of approach when someone comes up and asks the suffering question?
Well, first I recognize that it's likely personal, somebody might ask that question out of intellectual curiosity, but often I kind of want to wonder, like, and I always want to have the invitation that the answer I give is not going to be adequate, and that it'd likely be good to talk face to face sometime.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a pastoral care question more than it's a question of what's real, or a why question. I think that in our theology we have a really good resource in the hiddenness of God and the revealed nature of God. That I don't have answers necessarily why. We can talk about living in a broken, sinful world. We can talk about natural evil, like evil that exists in the world as a possibility. We can also talk about moral evil, what one human being does to another. But the deeper thing is always to point to the gospel. And here, not to overdo Keller, but he's just really good. He talks about how, the cross of Jesus Christ means that while we do not know the reason for our suffering, we can at least look at the cross of Christ and say it's not meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
And that we're not alone. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ shows us that although we may not know the reason for our suffering, it won't have the last word.
Mm-hmm.
That there is a restoration and a justice and a healing. Whereas in a secular viewpoint, you really can't say that. Like, say somebody goes in and shoots up a school and then commits suicide. There is a certain element of justice that will never be given in a world without God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people get away with it. Whereas from the Christian understanding of he will return to judge the living and the dead, that return to judge includes a healing and a retribution aspect to it. That
Mm-hmm.
evil will be judged and rejected. That which was corrupted by evil, stolen by evil, will be raised up and healed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's where like the article of hell really is actually important, right?
Yeah, and people are averse to that. They think it's like, why would God do that? That's mean. But also, do we want evil to continue unchecked forever?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so even that question of hell becomes a question of justice and what's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How do you see Lutheranism? Because that's one of the questions, right, that comes up. How do you see a distinctiveness in Lutheranism? And I know you've talked about this in the apologetic arena as well.
Mm-hmm.
But what's some of the distinctives you see in Lutheranism in comparison to non-denominational, Baptist, even Presbyterian, and then, of course, Roman Catholic?
Apologist or their
Yeah,
apologetic.
or in general. Kind of a twofold to that question. One, there's the apologetics. Perhaps we can get into that more later.
Yeah.
But probably more so even here, like when people ask that question, how do you go about articulating that? Because that's obviously something that would be very forward in the Small Catechism, where it is defining, how we systematize things and think about the Bible from a Lutheran perspective. So what kind of distinctives do you see there?
Yeah. Well, and you have to ask this question, like, why are you Lutheran? And I actually don't like that term. I think it's, it's all about the gospel. And especially for people with anxious consciences, people who are prone to not being sure. That's like water in the desert, it's refreshing. It seems to me, and I don't want to caricature here, but it seems to me that in some cases, the feel I get from denominations is that they have one thing they're kind of stuck on, or it's their main deal. So, like, when I think of Eastern Orthodoxy, there's a lot of things that come to mind, but icon seems to be a huge deal. When I think about Roman Catholicism, the papacy and the role of Mary seem to be a really hyper-focused thing. In the Baptist Church, it's, the decision you made for Jesus and your profession of faith through baptism. In the Reformed world, it seems like predestination and the sovereignty of God are kind of important controlling factors. As Lutherans, I would hope that the thing that we're really obsessed with and very careful to guard and share is the gospel. Namely, that we are really sinners, like from the top to the bottom, even when we think we're doing good. And evil is so pervasive, it's underneath and in everything, even though this is a good creation. And the gospel is the free forgiveness of sins and justification given to us by God through Jesus Christ, by no work of our own, in such a way that if we find ourselves repenting and asking for forgiveness, it's because grace already found us and motivated that and gave it. And I think you find that in the New Testament, that Paul is very focused on Christ crucified, the gospel. The gospel narratives are cruciform. They're focused on the passion of Christ and his resurrection. And so there's an element of Catholicity there, I think, that is gospel-centered. That's what makes Lutheranism distinct. And you can find that in all the other church bodies. But when we're functioning at our best as Lutherans, that's the thing that we're making clear.
Mm-hmm. So when you go from confirmation to something like you engage college kids, you have a college ULK, is that right? UNK, yeah. You deal with college kids, and then you deal with adult, converts, and you're doing discipleship and catechesis there. Let's jump to the adult, I guess. How do you use the Small Catechism in those conversations?
Yeah, we have a adult class. So my associate Tim teaches. He does this like 3 or 4 times a year. 8-week class called Essentials, and we have some written materials we put together that really focus on teaching the catechism from a worldview perspective, and trying to help the Christians locate themselves in the big story. The story of creation, redemption, sanctification. And I think that's a game changer for people. A lot of times, I've had people that take that course with us and they say, I just never knew what the Bible was about, like the whole story. I got, hints here and there. But for them to be able to locate themselves in that story. And here's the big shift from MTD. MTD is where I'm the character, I'm the main event of the story, and God is a supporting character who's going to help me when I need him to achieve my goals and dreams. The flip in the Christian worldview is that God is the center of everything. He is the main character, and we're supporting actors, and he allows us and invites us to be part of it. And that is the opposite of American feel-good consumer religion. And I see that's kind of what we're trying to teach, is to turn it around. And we're not doing it in such a way where, like, sometimes I like, how the Reformed have like a real focus on the glory of God. We can use that, that's good. But it becomes so focused on the glory and the supremacy of God that we don't have the incarnation being a focus, that God for us. So we want to flip it over, though, to make God the center of everything. But we also see God in being the center of everything, giving himself for us in Christ, which has a way of like making us not be the center anymore. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good, broad stroke. Let's go through the 6 chief parts. So like as you're teaching, as you're going through the 10 commandments, how do you orient and frame and then teach the commandments within the structure that you have?
Yeah, so the 10 commandments, what's a human being for, right? Secularism doesn't have a good answer for that, I don't think. MTD doesn't really, because you're in charge of saying what I'm for, my purpose, my dreams, my goals. Like the language of dreams and goals is pretty big in MTD. Kind of like living my best life, But in the commandments, we're trying to show that, look, this is God's like blueprint. It's his design for what it means to be a human being. What is a human for? And I can only understand what I'm for, what my goal is, if I can understand the God who created me in relationship with himself and in relationship with other people in a context of creation where I have work to do. And so when we're talking about the commandments, we're talking about what God first says yes to. We often think of the commandment as a no, but it's first a yes. So in the first commandment, you shall have no other gods, there's a yes to worship and a no to everything else. In the second commandment, there is a yes to using God's name in covenant relationship with him. And there's a no to worshiping other, or taking God's name and attaching it to other worship. In the third commandment, there's a yes to rest, invitation to rest. I heard somebody say that the Sabbath is one of the best guardrails for the doctrine of justification, because it reminds us it's not about us, that we can rest, that God works. Psalm 92, I think, is the psalm for the Sabbath. You have made me glad by your work, O Lord. But if the Sabbath is a yes to rest, it's a no to overwork and anxiety. You could go on and on and on. So you gotta frame the commandments in terms of what is the thing that God is saying yes to, what is he seeking to guard and keep, whether it be human dignity or marriage and family, your property, your reputation. And that's important for us as Lutherans, because we say the law always accuses. It's true for sinners, but it's not the only thing it does. And it's first a word that affirms and says, this is what it means to be human. Moving on to the Apostles' Creed, that's the story, right? Like this is the story of God creating you, redeeming you, and making you new in hope of everlasting life. And there's a wonderful narrative there. The whole Bible is the narrative of the Apostles' Creed. Obviously very abbreviated, but I mean, it's the main thing. It's the rule of faith. And so our goal is to help people to see themselves within that story, that they're a living part of it through baptism, through faith in Christ. And we can also talk about the character of God, who God is and what he does is what the creed is. Lord's Prayer is looking forward to the hope we have. And this is where you can interact with other worldviews really well. Like, what's the secular eschatology? Or by eschatology, I mean the last things. What is the utopia that, or the better life that secularism looks toward? It's human progress, which is really frustrating because it never works out. We're really good at hoping, though. I think that maybe this time we'll get it. You could talk about an MTD eschatology, which is basically to have a nice, happy, successful life. But of course, you get there and you're like, is this all there is? And so then when we talk about the Lord's Prayer, each of those petitions is what God has promised me in the future for my good. He's promised that I will live in a world where his name is hallowed. He's promised me that I will live in a kingdom where he rules in all authority. He's promised me a world where his will be done, where there's daily bread, where there's forgiveness, where there's deliverance from evil. We have it now in part, but we wait for it 100%. It's been given to us by faith, but now, and we have the first fruits of it, right? And we're waiting for the full consummation. And so I would say when you're talking about Lord's Prayer, you're talking about future hope, which is what our prayers are, right? They're future oriented. Baptism, confession, Lord's Supper are a little bit trickier because they're not like so much worldview oriented. I mean, with baptism, though, we're talking about identity. Who am I? And that identity shapes how I live my life. As Lutherans, I think we talk about baptism typically as forgiveness of sins. If you read all the New Testament texts on baptism, it's more like on how you live. Like die with Christ and rise with him, put on Christ, walk in the new life. Confession, how do you deal with guilt? I mean, there's an interesting book I read about maybe 10 years ago called So You've Been Publicly Shamed. And it's like talking about all these early internet, social media, canceling type scenarios where people would get on a plane and tweet something, and by the time they land, they're like lost their job,
Yeah.
And so there's not a lot of forgiveness in the secular world. I think somebody's called this like secular hell, like you're just canceled, you're done. And even beyond redeeming. And so we as Christians have this beautiful tool of confession and absolution by which we can have a good conscience. And we don't have to live in the past. And then finally, the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper really ties us into the whole story. What I love about communion is in the Lord's Supper, it is a past, present, and future meal. Because just like the Israelites would look back on the Exodus and look forward to future redemption, when we gather at the table, we're looking back to the sacrifice of Christ once and for all upon the cross for us. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you're proclaiming the Lord's death until future he comes. And so we're looking forward to the great and final Exodus, the great salvation that we participate in. And right in the middle of that, in that moment of journey, we're receiving nourishment and connection together in the body of Christ. Is there anything in secularism that's remotely like that? I mean, maybe going to a Taylor Swift concert is this amazing experience of feeling connected to all these people and and all singing the same song together, but obviously pales in comparison to this weekly rhythm, ideally, I think, weekly rhythm that we have of coming to the supper and participating in this cosmic redemption that Christ has given us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does do the opposite of what the secular world does today, where we tear down statues, we doubt our fathers and the founders, and so we're always tearing down everything that's gone before in the process of trying to create something new in the future. But both in the Old Testament and then in present day, there is this notion to where we are fully connected to that which is sufficient in the past, which connects to the promise of that which is in the future, and that remembrance is something that it's not just a remembrance of something that has happened, but something because it has happened, it affects you today, which is true for the Israelites, right? And that when they're so what is it? You find the lamb without blemish. It must be killed. The blood must be put on the doorpost. You must eat of that lamb, and then you must remember. And the idea is that when you remember, you're saying, well, what happened to my ancestors when they were brought out of Egypt, that affects me today. Like, I'm not in slavery in Egypt today because of what God has done.
We were slaves in Egypt.
Yeah, we were slaves in Egypt. So there's
generations later.
Yeah. So there's that connection to the broader narrative, which seems very void today.
Yeah, I mean, and I mentioned this earlier, but what is secularism passing on? I don't even think secularism is passing on, democratic liberalism, like the kind of the founding fathers, their approach to governance, because it's all a cycle of oppressor and oppressed, victim and victimizer, and they just trade places, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So as you teach this, do you find that helps then as you then turn to biblical narratives? So let's say you go through the catechesis and you kind of walk through it in the way that you just described. So now you've got members that are going to continue in their biblical literacy. Hopefully they still lean on the catechism and such. They might move on to other books in the Book of Concord. But does that help give them a framework so that as you're going through the lectionary, some of these readings begin to find a place where they have a paradigm where this begins to make more sense?
Yeah, I think the lectionary is only as effective as people are catechized. And I love the lectionary, so we just need to catechize people better. Because and I think the more you're catechized, the more you have a Christian understanding of the world, the narrative, the story inside of you, the better you'll integrate sermons. And it's not just intellectual, conceptual. I mean, the more you have a devotional life and the more you have Christian disciplines, the more you're going to integrate that stuff. You won't have as many weeds, in the heart. So, yeah. And I think even, our preaching needs to be catechetical, just always be bringing up the catechism, like quote the catechism often in the sermon. Not in like long form, but just like, fear, love, and trust. We know that one, right? Mm-hmm. Try to connect the sermon to catechetical concepts. Like, what does it mean to be a human being? Like, why might God give us this commandment? How is our God different than other things we worship?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think you get more bang for your buck with sermons when people are catechized well.
What do you notice in the Lutheran Church when when churches or pastors or individuals, when they kind of move away from the catechism, right? So you even said you grew up in Lutheranism, but the catechism was pretty foreign to you. So what's the implications when we don't use this as something that grounds us, that gives us a framework and a narrative to help understand everything else that we're doing? What do we drift towards when we do that?
Well, my first experience of Christianity was Pentecostalism. And then I came into Lutheranism later. And I don't think I really became actually Lutheran in my thinking until college when I read Walther and some other Book of Concord stuff. But what I do know is that when I was not a Lutheran, I lived in the fads. I lived in the whatever's popular on Christian radio or Christian broadcasting, whatever's in a Christian bookstore. And so I think that my faith was more kind of leaning toward, what's the most popular book people are reading? Purpose-Driven Life, Prayer of Jabez, So I would say that when we don't have the catechesis deeply rooted in us, in a tradition, like the Lutheran Church, we typically will trend non-denominational or kind of low church Protestant. And the trajectory there is that I just don't see that as enduring. And like, I know a lot of young people who I think they're really converted in non-denominational churches where they're just sharing the gospel and being very kind of zealous and intentional in their faith. There's something there that we lack a little bit sometimes. But then I'll talk to those young people, and maybe they've been non-denominational, or they have been Lutheran and then they went to one of those churches for a few years, and then they come back, or they discover our church and they're like, there's got to be something more. There's got to be something that's deeper, church history. So yeah, I think that without the catechism, without that framework, which really connects us back to the whole past history of Christian teaching. I mean, like Augustine would, have the three parts: commandment, creed, Lord's Prayer. Different ordering than Luther. But that's been the standard way of catechesis, is some type of Christian morality, some reflection on the salvation history narrative, and then how to pray. And if you don't have that, what do you have? You might have the latest sermon series, or the latest Christian speaker. And I don't know how well that passes on generation to generation. And I would hope that people wouldn't deconstruct their faith. It seems like a lot of the deconstructive narratives happen in kind of that more low church culture. I may be wrong about that, but it
when you say
like
deconstructive, what do you mean?
It's like the ex-evangelical type, grew up in the church, had, kind of focus on the family upbringing, was really rooted in youth group. And then now I'm just kind of over it. I've seen too much hypocrisy, in the church. I've seen too much political involvement. And then people they kind of grow out of it. Like, if I think about all the kids I was in youth group with, I don't think a lot of them are in the church anymore.
Yeah, there is something to where if it's not built into a formalized structure, you can latch onto one specific thing. But then, like you said, eventually you're going to move on to other things, or maybe you grow out of that specific aspect that's been overemphasized or exclusively emphasized, and you don't have any kind of full framework to fall back on. Or even that's when liturgical flows are helpful.
Yeah.
Both within the church structure, but then even within your home life. Like, you see it with the church structure when someone's old and you go to them and they know the Lord's Prayer or they know pieces of the liturgy, that sticks. But then even at home, when you have this flow, or that's why I think the seasons are so important. Lent is different from Easter, which is different from Advent, which is different from Epiphany. So as you go into these different ones, you kind of move and you focus on something new, but that goes with the flow of your life. So it kind of forms you three-dimensionally. But those things stick with you, and they're kind of tougher to unshackle yourself from being shackled in a good way, right?
Yeah, you have to have something you participate in. And when I have, people who come to our church from maybe a non-denominational, low church kind of context, they're really hungering for the sacramental participation of getting out of their head, instead of a 45-minute sermon with lots of stories and illustrations, and they just want to walk forward and receive the body and blood of Christ. I think that has a way of forming us much more than we're aware of. Our congregation actually just moved to weekly communion, and we've been in it about 6 months, and very interested to just see how that changes our congregation.
Have you noticed any changes yet?
Nobody's complained yet. I haven't heard any complaints. Sometimes it makes service go a little longer, and that can be a challenge because we have 3 services in the morning stacked on top of each other, and the parking lot becomes a mess. Yeah, we polled our congregation. We preached on it and then polled, and it was 83% of the congregation said, yeah, let's do it.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And a lot of our people, they grew up Catholic, or they grew up or maybe their LCMS church they came from has weekly communion.
Do you notice that that's a desire in younger people in your church, especially?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And even like a desire for the liturgy is there among young people.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I can just speak for myself. I mean, I grew up, my first exposure to Christianity was kind of, I don't know if you remember those Wow worship CDs, you know.
Mm-mm.
This is maybe like a early 2000, late 90s kind of thing where churches would always be singing like the kind of happy clappy kind of songs, and sanctuary was, you know, kind of bare. It just had like a couple fake plants, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And everything, well, there was also the seeker-sensitive kind of movement, church growth movement, which kind of took things down a little bit in terms of depth.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember going to my first real liturgical worship service in Staplehurst, Nebraska in Advent, and just being kind of lost, like, what in the world is going on here? But being kind of in awe of like, wow, this is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Something about the rhythm, that's the predictability that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Because my spiritual upbringing, like in the first couple of years of my Christian faith, was very much based on emotion. And so it was very much focused on like, who's on fire for Jesus, you know? And I'm like, I'm not a super outwardly like excited person. And I'm like, am I excited?
Mm-hmm.
What if I'm not, you know? And so being in a context where I can kind of count on what's going to happen
Mm-hmm.
is really helpful. Which earlier on in like my spiritual growth, that was like the enemy. Spontaneity was the thing. And there's a place for that. But knowing that like that I'm going to come to worship and I'm going to receive absolution every time.
Mm-hmm.
Lord's Supper, creed, prayers. I can kind of let go of trying and just receive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the church needs both. I mean, like, I kind of think of like, there's in the church, you've got like revival Christianity and you've got like institutional stable Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And the revival Christianity is kind of like teenagers in love.
Mm-hmm.
It's like really like up and down. It's volatile. It's really intense, but it's deep,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not very mature. And then you have like expressions of Christianity where it's like, we've been married 30 years and we have like a china cabinet.
Yeah.
And like, we have like investments and we have money in the bank. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And like the revival Christianity is like, is good because it's like zealous and it's in love with Jesus. It wants to share Christ with everybody, but it is so up and down that it's like a roller coaster, and it's like a teenage relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like on again, off again. And then, so there's a good there and a danger there, but then in the more established kind of Orthodox Christianity, it's like, there may not be as much like intimacy unless it's a like a depth of, I've learned how to love this person for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And we're intentional about fostering, you know, growth and togetherness. And so there's a like Orthodox safeguard of creeds and liturgy and confessions. If we don't have any zeal to that, I think it becomes liberal Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
Can't talk. It becomes, you know, kind of just hollowed out,
Mm-hmm.
or it just becomes kind of, you know, dead orthodoxy. But if you really get the heart of what that is, I think those two can coexist in a certain way.
So how do we pull off having both? You know, we had Tim Wood on, who did a lot of demographic study.
Yeah.
And he referenced, I think it was, who's the demographer? Lyman Stone. I think he did the big study. So I think it came from there. But it talked about that the Lutheran Church, I think, was top 2 or top 3 when it comes to evangelism, which is very surprising.
Yeah.
But then when you dig in, and this makes sense to me, the biggest evangelism that we have is people convert from other denominations to Lutheranism. So we're certainly not the bottom of the totem pole, but we're certainly not the top of the totem pole of, you know, reaching out to wayward teenagers and college kids.
Yeah.
And then Lutheranism becomes their first step into Christianity. Usually non-denominational Baptists, they do that. And then as they grow in their faith and they realize there's got to be some more depth here. Maybe
Yeah.
they start wondering about the sacraments, and then they move into a church like the Lutheran Church. So that seems like where we're at in the broad scheme of the church in the West. So the question is, how do we do both of those things? How do we not abandon that aspect of what we're really good at and we're built to be good at, because we have the depth, we have the systematics, we have good answers to very deep questions. We don't shed things for new fads. We can't lose that. But how do we also balance that with, being able to reach people with a certain level of excitement?
Yeah. Well, I think Luther says, I think it's the Heidelberg Disputation. He says we always use the best things in the worst way. And so we have to be careful that we don't use the rich theology we have to be insular and just kind of focused on ourselves. And in the case of like the more revivalistic churches, to be careful that they don't become an end in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And, in the history of the church, those movements existed within the church. They didn't become sectarian always.
Mm-hmm.
I think like I have I'm really thankful for the way that like popular American evangelical approach will just reach people that we don't reach. Like getting a group of teenagers together and doing like preaching the gospel and people, maybe they come up and they make a decision for Christ, and, we have problems with that type of language, but I'm like, okay, fine, I'll work with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because those kids who come into our church, or adults, they kind of burn out on that, but then they make the best Lutherans.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are the ones who show up and they can pray out loud with people. They're ready to share their faith. They have a devotional life. They're thankful to hear that their justification doesn't depend upon their devotion life, or they're sharing their faith, or they're doing all the things for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But I honestly think, like my wife and I used to have this joke. We used to work with youth in St. Louis at our field education church. And our joke was like, we should send all these kids to Baptist church camp, and then we'll work on catechesis, because they have this intense experience of faith and it works for a bit, but then they kind of run up against the wall of their own sinful nature and life.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of times, like, we can just get apathetic and we don't recognize the riches we have in our own church body.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the people who are coming from outside who are like, what? Like, wow, this is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Like the real body and blood of Christ, absolution. I hear people talking about how they can't live without the absolution every week.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, oh, come teach my confirmation class.
Yeah.
Come tell that story.
I've heard it. I think it's kind of a cool illustration where you need to build on-ramps,
Mm-hmm.
but then you need to make sure that whatever the on-ramp is leading to is as pure and beautiful and good and true as possible,
Yeah.
right? And that's where I think that illustration's helped me, in that sometimes there's one approach where you take the thing itself, perhaps like the divine service, and you say, let's mold this so that becomes the on-ramp, so that becomes the thing that someone who has no notion of kind of historical Christianity or, any of these kind of deep things within the Lutheran Church, we're not going to put anything there that would confuse them or could possibly be, a barrier. So then you water that down. And of course, the negative there is, well, then now you're not giving them the full richness and the full expression of what we believe, teach, and confess, and what is formative, right? So that sabotages itself. Then you have the other approach, though, where you can only have that pure, beautiful thing, but there's no on-ramp. So there's no reasonable, the Holy Spirit can of course work, but there's not a reasonable route for somebody who doesn't understand Lutheranism to ramp on. So, it seems like that's where I don't have much experience with youth. That's not anything I've done at any point really in my ministry. I've dabbled in it, I help with it, but I've never been, the youth guy. But it seems like that's an area where, having youth group get together and play, dodgeball or whatever it is, like that can be very accessible. That can, give a safe place for high school kids. You don't have to be in that setting, memorizing the catechism, or genuflecting in something, because that's you're doing a social gathering, right? So there's these opportunities for on-ramps, and then you kind of lead that into more formal education. And then, ideally they can come to the divine service right off the bat, of course, but you're also kind of prepping and teaching. So I don't know what your thoughts are on how to do that, or how you've done that in your church there in Kearney.
Well, honestly, I think that's one of the reasons why communion like closed communion becomes so controversial, because in that context, we made communion like an outreach tool,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like it's not that, it's an inside catechized body of Christ unity meal. And yeah, I think that, there's so much we could say, but and the old strategy of like inviting somebody to church to evangelize them, I just don't know if that's the best strategy. Yeah, I mean, it's fine. Anybody can come.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that anybody who comes to our church, as weird as, because I think worship should feel weird.
Yeah.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're talking about Jesus as a lamb. Like, what does that mean? There should be elements that are weird and foreign, but that's okay.
Everything good. I mean, if you go to your first football game, it's
Yeah.
weird.
Like, what is this?
People are yelling. They're wearing
Yeah.
weird things. You know, I mean, if you go to a concert, a concert's weird. It's got its own complete ethos that is different
Yeah.
from anything else you do in the month.
And I don't think we have to always be careful to translate Christianity through preaching.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just saying justification, you have to say, well, what is justification,
Mm-hmm.
etc. I mean, that's just normal. But, worship, it's okay if worship is kind of weird and if it's more of an insider thing. What we want is the character and even the affect of the people in worship to be so warm and so glowing with Christ that no matter how odd worship might feel, you feel welcome, because the living, breathing people in this congregation want to know me and love me.
Mm-hmm.
Not in a weird, creepy way, like when you're like the only 30, 40 something with kids who walks into a church and everybody's like, oh, young people.
Yeah.
We're all over 70 and
Yeah.
you're going to save our church. No, but I mean, just taking a real genuine interest in people and welcoming them into that space. And this is where I think that like low stakes kind of community events are helpful. Like in our college ministry, we have a Bible study, but we all get together and eat. And I love just seeing all these students come, some who are new to the faith, some exploring it, some not sure what even a Lutheran is. And they're able to come together and have fellowship, have community, and have study of God's word. And even like a life group or small group can be a place where you can invite somebody in, or even just Christians being intentional about making friendships with non-Christians. That I think is probably more successful than come to church with me.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, that sounds kind of like a 1960s, everybody goes to church mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you have the strong relationship beforehand,
Yeah.
That's probably quite helpful, because then you can actually dialogue about the church service
Mhm.
to where, if it's someone that you've met right off the bat, then they come to church. If they're confused by something, like they might just pull away from the entire thing, to where if you already have that relationship built up, if you're, trained for triathlons together, or are part of a reading group, or, whatever, like
Yeah.
at that point, there's a relationship built where you can then be the person to walk through, to teach, to help them understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even creating a little bit of distance between, there's different levels of fellowship. There's the fellowship of I'm here and I'm listening to the word with you and I'm interested. There's the fellowship of I'm getting to know people. Maybe I'm singing along with the worship. And then there's the level of, I think I want to join this church and become part of its communion.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a little bit of a distance there. And I think that sometimes we're hyper sensitive to, well, people might leave if there's a little bit of a gap between being here and communing with us. That period of time is a time of discernment for that person to learn and to really recognize the value. Like I've had people who join our church who, they come up and they cross their arms or do this before they receive communion. And I want to give them communion so bad,
Mm-hmm.
but I give them a blessing because I know they're going through our instruction. They approach communion, I think, with a lot more reverence than probably some of our members do,
Mm-hmm.
like when they get there, because they're like, wow, I learned what this is. I became a part of the community. I was taught by it. And now I'm being formally accepted into the community.
Mm-hmm.
We want everything so quickly. We want everything instantaneous. And discipleship takes time. And even entrance into the church, It can take time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people value it more. I mean,
Yeah.
across the board, studies show that in every aspect. You know, if
Mm-hmm.
easy come, easy go.
Yeah.
If if it takes a little bit to become part of a group, you value that group more.
Yeah.
And especially if that process is purposeful, and you can understand why that would have barriers to it. I mean, you would see that like with the gym. Like you have to start off, you got to figure out, what do I do, and then you kind of learn the ropes, and then you kind of learn certain workouts, and then you might be able to join a class or something like that. But you probably don't want to come into your first workout and join a class. It's probably gonna it's going to obliterate you. So you kind of warm up, you learn, and then you kind of grow into that, and then you appreciate the community that has those same values that are shared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like, we really want to know you and love you
Mm-hmm.
in this community for your whole life.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, you might, transfer someplace. But I just don't think we take the confirmation vows seriously enough.
They're pretty serious.
Yeah, unto death. I'll be faithful to hearing God's word and receiving the Lord's Supper, and also to this confession of faith until death. And that's why I think that, we don't have to be afraid to reach out to our inactive members and say, hey, where have you been? Like, I'm not trying to shame you. I love you. I can't be your pastor if I'm not in proximity to you. And when Jesus instituted the supper, he had you in mind. And we want you to be here.
How do you reach out to members? Do you have a process? Like delinquent members?
We've been working on that quite a bit. I've got great elders. They get on the phone, they call, they text, email, and eventually we send paper letter. And it's funny. You'll have some people who are deeply offended by reaching out, because I think it's a shame thing. But then you have other people who are like, thank you for reaching out. And it's so rewarding when you see people who have not been in worship and then they're there most Sundays. Doesn't always happen that way. Like if I reach out to 100 people, maybe like 10 will be there. A lot of times when you reach out, you're just confirming that they're at another church.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, like let's acknowledge that. Just want to make sure that you have a church where you're confident in the confession, you believe it, and you're going to be a faithful Christian.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll jump back in. All right, and Bennett says we are back. So let's jump back into apologetics a little bit. So I know you've talked about how there's kind of an Arminian, and there's different approaches from different denominations on how they approach apologetics. So if you can kind of walk through what some of those differences are, and then what's distinct about a Lutheran approach to apologetics.
Yeah, so I think at least my experience of a lot of apologetics is it has kind of a Arminian feel to it, meaning it appeals to the free will. It's kind of this understanding that if you had more information, if you had a good argument presented to you, that you would naturally accept the Christian faith. And so, you have movies like God's Not Dead, or even books like The Case for Christ, and they just kind of make this clear argument. And typically presenting evidences, historical or scientific evidences. And those aren't bad, but I do think it kind of assumes that the will is going to agree with things that are obvious. And I think the issue with that is, as Lutherans, we talk about the bondage or the captivity of the will, meaning that we don't have an information problem, we have a will problem. That you can give people all the information in the world, it can be very obvious, but they'll still walk away from it because it doesn't affirm what they want to be true. So I cannot by my own reason or strength believe in Jesus Christ, my Lord, or come to him. Third article of the Catechism. I don't think that is always the guiding principle in a lot of American apologetics. Then there is a Reformed approach, a presuppositional approach. So Cornelius Van Til, I think it's John Frame, and I'm not like Francis Schaeffer kind of is in that camp. They talk about the Reformed epistemology, this understanding that this goes back to Calvin, this inner innate sense of God, the sense of the divine that we have. And so Reformed apologetics is going to assume the Christian worldview. It's not going to like start out in a neutral space and like try to convince you of theism and then convince you of the resurrection. It's going to be more geared towards like, hey, Christianity is true, and everybody deep down knows there's a God. And so let's kind of critique other worldviews and try to push on their pressure points and show where they're logically inconsistent. And then we can show the inner coherency of the Christian worldview, because it is reality.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, like people go back and forth and debate these things. You can read like 5 views on apologetics from Zondervan, and people get really passionate. And there's like some distinct types of apologetics. You have like a cumulative case approach where you're just giving all the different evidences so that like a court case, you would favor Christianity as true. You have the evidential approach, which is going to really focus on historical arguments. I think Lutheranism typically trends towards that, like John Warwick Montgomery, his kind of training, like legal training, looking at the historicity of the Gospels.
Is N.T. Wright kind of that way?
Yeah,
Like,
N.T. Wright, he's very much like a narrative theologian type. I mean,
Okay.
He's really going to bring in the whole picture of the whole story of God and Israel. But his resurrection of the Son of God is a really wonderful, good piece of like respectable literature or scholarship on the topic. He has an immense knowledge of the views that ancient people had, Greeks and Jews, about death and the afterlife. And then you have the classic, like this is like C.S. Lewis or R.C. Sproul, which would try to reason you towards, well, C.S. Lewis is kind of eclectic, but kind of classic argument to convince you of theism through the ontological proofs or the cosmological proofs.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you've established theism, then to move to Christ. So people get into all kinds of debates about this. As far as the Lutheran approach, I think that a Lutheran approach is going to recognize the bondage of the will, the captivity of the will, meaning that I can't by my own reason or will or strength come to Christ. It doesn't matter how many evidences I have. However, the Holy Spirit can use those evidences and those arguments to clear the way for me to become a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be the Spirit's work. But also there's, the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. Theology of glory, meaning that we try to find God and understand God through the visible things in this world, in nature and circumstances. Theology of the cross, meaning that God is hidden in suffering and his apparent opposites. So when Luther says when God wants to justify you, he makes you into a sinner first.
Mm-hmm.
When God wants to give you life, he kills you first. He brings you low to bring you up. I find that some arguments in apologetics can trend towards theology of glory. They're saying too much, especially when they're trying to explain the presence of evil and suffering. They typically will lean on free will explanations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's helpful.
I've liked C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain,
Mm-hmm.
But he does kind of lean in that direction a little bit.
Yeah.
Then I came across I think it was Augustine's. Yeah, Augustine's in, which one was it? I think it was his Confessions, where he talks about that. And he takes more of a Job approach, or maybe it's Aquinas. It might be Aquinas, actually. But Augustine does something similar. So I think Aquinas gets it from Augustine. But Aquinas really leans in on Job. And he has this aspect of, no, you just have to zoom out, because that's what God does to Job, right? It's like, oh yeah, where were you when, when the world was created? Were you there when the wind was kept at the four corners, or when the, boundaries for the water, or Leviathan or Behemoth? So there's that aspect of, you might not understand your suffering, but if you had the eyes of God, if you could zoom out, you would understand that. And I think that's where I think Augustine uses kind of the piano piece, where he's like, God's creating an orchestra and you're a note within that, so God plays your note, but that note also needs to disappear so that the next note can take its place, and that's kind of how we understood death and articulated it that way. But that was a little bit more helpful, I thought, when I came across that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure different times different audiences. God uses a lot of different voices and reasons, but I did like that aspect where it just kind of, that made more sense of just zoom out. Point being, you're not going to understand it, right?
Yeah.
Don't try to rationalize it. You just have to kind of trust that God works through these things. And history is very helpful in that way. Tolkien's really good. Like, have you read the Silmarillion?
I haven't, no.
I mean, it plays out in the Lord of the Rings too. Like, there's this line from Galadriel when Frodo's in Lothlorien, and she says something along the lines of, "We've been fighting the long defeat." And, you know, her point is, but we're fighting on the good side. But it does not look like there's any way that this is going to lead to victory. And of course it does in the end with the destruction of the ring. But point being, but you would still rather fight for good, even if it's this long defeat. And as when you do the Silmarillion, it's a long history. So it's dealing with, you know, thousands and tens of thousands of years. So you watch these like deep calamities take place.
Yeah.
But then you see that through that deep calamity, there's this little remnant of hope. And, you know, 500 years later, there's some kind of goodness that comes out of that. So God works through that. So like seeing that narratively and historically or mythically, I think is very helpful.
It sounds really biblical too.
Mm-hmm.
I think we just, as Lutherans, we want to say what the scriptures say and not go beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get into some of the like more, it depends on who you're talking to and what the circumstances are. We can get into more speculative thinking, but we just have to be really careful with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because speculation doesn't offer comfort or certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just been one of my concerns with popular American apologetics, is they give answers that really appeal to the will, and like we can account for evil because of free will and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But also I would say Lutherans do not seem to have excelled at apologetics, in the sense that who do you know who's like a really well-known Lutheran apologist?
I know two, John Warwick Montgomery, who you mentioned, and then Adam Francisco. And I don't know, Adam Francisco is really good. I don't know how well known he would be outside the Lutheran Church.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I think that like when I go to the Christian bookstore, I don't find a lot of Lutheran books.
Mm-hmm.
We're not really in the mainstream. And I think, as we were talking about before, we're kind of late to the game in America. There's a lot of like religious history that took place in America before we even showed up.
Mm-hmm.
Not all. I mean, there were like the early like East Coast Pennsylvania Lutherans and stuff. But when the LCMS folks came, it was pretty late.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot had happened in the religious world of America.
So what do you think we could do within the Lutheran Church to contribute to the broader apologetic discussions?
Well, I'd love it if our seminaries had classes. I don't know if they do. I don't remember specific apologetic training in my seminary training.
Mm-hmm.
It might be different now. I don't know. I think that every pastor has to be an apologist. Every DCE has to be an apologist. We just have to get into the conversation, and it doesn't mean we're perfect or we know everything, but we have to be functional and growing.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't live in a world where we can assume Christendom. You know, we have to just be ready to give an answer.
Mm-hmm. Are there areas that our theology or our systematics can lend itself in this direction? I mean, you've mentioned the Small Catechism, of course, but are there certain things that we have already in our heritage that just lend itself really well to where you could expand this into a modern apologetic structure that speaks really to the culture in a proficient way?
Well, we're so rooted in the Western Church, and we have so many resources, you know, and it's interesting, if you read the Church Fathers, a lot of times they were doing apologetics. Justin Martyr was doing apologetics, speaking to both Jew and to pagan Greeks. Irenaeus was speaking to Gnosticism. Aquinas was speaking to Islam in some cases because of the influence to the south of him, or in like, you know, southern France and Spain. I think that maybe we tried to speak to modernism, and I don't know how well we've done to postmodernism. I think that Lutheran theology, though, can speak to postmodernism pretty well because there's a lot of paradox, and we just seem to be okay with paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating that in the uncertainty that people have, or maybe the kind of low church Protestantism that they had, recently people have been attracted to Reformed churches. I don't know if that's still a thing, like the young, restless Reformed.
I don't know.
Reformed churches, for a while, like in the early 2000s, like Reformed churches were very popular in evangelical circles because the Calvinistic theological framework gave people certainty and a really big God, with like clear answers. I wonder, though, if Lutheranism has a way of speaking to, we're giving clear answers, but we're allowing some space for paradox and mystery.
I do think that's what people look for, because there's been more of an influx into the Catholic Church. We've talked about this before, many different reasons, but I think they like the mystery aspect, where they, especially with the sacramental, obviously the way they approach the saints and stuff, there's just kind of a profound, ethereal mystery that they gesture towards, but they elevate. And I think people very much like that. I mean, before that, there was a big influx into like Buddhism, right? If you want to talk about, if you're a Westerner, white girl in college, I think that was kind of the main target that went towards Buddhism. I had a handful of friends that kind of went that way. I don't think they stayed there, but nothing's more of a mystery than a deeply rooted Eastern philosophy, across the world 1,000 years ago, but they were attracted to that mystery, so I think that they've accessed that. But the Lutheran Church has more of a systematic approach than the Catholic Church, in our German heritage, obviously the way the Book of Concord's structured. But to your point, we leave much more to mystery than, say, double predestination would, or Presbyterian. So it seems like we would be leveraged there, where we can say, well, we can give a little bit more answers. We can push back against certain aspects that are only mysterious and not really biblically rooted, such as you pray to the saints, something like that. You can say, okay, we're not going to go that far, but we do stop short and then gaze at the mystery of God.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's a positive role of the internet, It's the thing about the internet, for all the bad, I mean, people are able to be much more ecumenical and also be much more, well, I mean, like it used to be, if you wanted to explore Roman Catholicism, you had to go to Mass, or if you wanted to explore Lutheranism, you had to come to worship, to the divine service. Well, now you can get on and you can watch anything. And you can listen to podcasts and you can hear conversations. And so it's a lot of cross-pollination going on, and for whatever reason, though, we have, as Lutherans, kind of stayed. We're kind of like the kids at the middle school dance who are kind of over by the bleachers, just by ourselves,
Yeah.
Not dancing with anybody, I don't know why that is.
Yeah. So I know we got to wrap up here soon because you got to drive all the way back to Kearney, Nebraska. But is there one apologetic structure, framework that you've come across in your studies that you really like and you find that it's very efficacious, that you would you could speak to and then maybe explain for us? Well,
for me, it's, especially just asking the questions and see where they go. Because there's a way you can disarm people. I mean, you have to be careful about the way you're talking, because, like, for example, if I get excited about something, I can come off as intense, and like I have to be careful that I'm not like coming off as aggressive, if I get really into talking with somebody. But like, let's say, okay, let's try this out. Let's say that you believe that doesn't matter what I do in my bedroom if I'm a consenting adult, and love is love. Well, let's start with that. Love is love. Let's say that's your worldview. I could approach you by just giving you all the information and telling you all the reasons why that's not correct. Or I could say, well, so let me ask you this question. Do you think there should be rules for sex at all? Should society have any type of guidelines or rules for sex? Imagine that you're a secular person. Like, what would you say?
Yeah, I think at first they might say no, but I think if you pushed, they're going to say yes. Like, they're going to say, well, obviously
lowest
something
common
like,
denominator.
Yeah,
rules,
rape or, has to be an adult, has to be a functioning adult. They're going to say certainly things like that. I'm sure that they might go further than that, but you probably have to pry to get some other answers.
Yeah. So, okay, we can agree on maybe like consent, no incest, nothing underage. None of those like really taboo things. It's like a lowest common denominator secular ethic for sexual ethics. Well, I mean, you could go another direction and ask, well, why? And if you asked why, honestly, you could get into some really deep discussions about like, well, how do we even determine morality? Or you could take the turn of saying, well, do you believe in God? So now let's say you're talking to somebody who is, love is love, but I'm a Christian. Okay, so there should be rules for sex. We agree on these. If God is the creator of this world, our bodies, and our male-female sexuality, does he have the right to give us any rules?
I think you'd have to say yes.
I think you'd have to say yes. Okay, if you agree yes, then how would we know the rules? Has he given us any hints, clues, maybe obvious signs that would tell us that these are the rules that everybody's accountable to and everybody knows? Well, maybe. Does male and female count? Is that a hint? Is it a clue? Is the fact that we're created male and female by God arbitrary or just random, or does it actually have a function and a purpose? And then you can even go deeper into, well, okay, and let's say somebody says, yeah, but that's unloving. That doesn't feel, what if somebody has a desire for something and the desire doesn't go away? Well, if you have a pervasive, continuing desire towards one of those three taboos that we would say is off limits sexually, what if it doesn't go away? Is the desire legitimate? So then I think you can gradually begin to point out how the same justification somebody might use to maybe pursue like underage partner because it's pervasive and it feels good and it's what I want. That same argument is the same argument we're using for all kinds of other sexual behavior that we don't see affirmed by God in scripture or nature. Right. So I think you just got to kind of get after like the deeper questions. You have to be really patient and you have to really restrain the way you talk so that you don't come off as too aggressive. And sometimes you have to recognize when a conversation has hit its end. You're going to do more damage if you keep pressing, even if somebody's being illogical. But you've given them something to think about. Because a lot of times when people say things like love is love, how'd you get there? There's typically not a consistent worldview underneath it. That I think is the most effective way of doing apologetics. And if you're talking about a paradigm or a structure, I think that's the best.
I think in your 2019 presentation, you mentioned the fact that a question works like a virus and that the question's something that sits there. So if you just speak at them, right, if you give them, well, here's what this says, here's some data, here's what this Bible verse says, and you just kind of throw that at them, they'll be defending against it, naturally speaking. But if you put a question, like kind of some of the questions that you put there, or, there could be, that simple question is something that sits in the back of someone's mind like a virus. And, they'll be laying in bed, 2 weeks later, and sometimes that question pops up. And I've had that before where I've disagreed with somebody on something, and often all my mind changed. And it's some kind of question that sits there, and then it just keeps coming back, and it keeps coming back, and then I have to wrestle with the question, and it doesn't go away, and then it begins to reprogram my mind as I start to allow that question to permeate and to challenge different presuppositions that I've had. And that's, so I remember you saying that, and that stuck with me, of that question works like a virus, and it really does.
Yeah, and questions are wonderful because when you pronounce things to people, and there is a place to declare things in a trusting relationship you have with somebody. Because I think when you meet somebody, the first question they have deep in their mind is, does this person really care about me? And am I safe in talking to them? if you have that kind of relationship with people, you can more easily or effectively pronounce and say, this is right, this is wrong. But when you ask a question, you're kind of doing the opposite of the fight and flight mechanism of like, I have to defend myself. It invites curiosity and openness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really effective when we as Christians ask the question, not to do like a gotcha, but because I genuinely want to understand your position as a human being, what you believe.
Mm-hmm.
And, questions also communicate respect to people, that I'm giving you the respect to listen to you and not just listen to you in such a way that I'm waiting to speak,
Mm-hmm.
And when you have like when I was more in like an Arminian revivalistic church setting, evangelism felt very much like you got to go get them.
Mm-hmm.
Time's running out. If we recognize that conversion is a work of the Holy Spirit, where and when God wills, like we say in the Augsburg Confession, then we can be a lot more patient. We have to be intentional, but we can be patient and recognize I'm not in control of this process. I'm going to really care and love for people and ask good questions and really try to build their trust, because they might start to ask me questions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. John Rasmussen. Thank you for your time, for coming out here. This has been a lot of fun. And yeah, if anyone wants to learn more from you, can you say the podcast that you do again?
It's called Every Moment His, just those 3 words. And I think it's on Spotify. I actually don't do a lot with it. I do the podcast. I don't like put it out there. Every Moment His. And if you go to our church's website, holycrosskearney.org, you can find it there too.
Yep. Well, thank you very much. God bless and cheers.
Yep. Thanks.